Jessie Sage, June 10th, 1978. I was born in Ames, Iowa. It was a great life, good existence, had a large family, there's seven boys and two sisters, so there was always somebody to play with. It really wasn't until September 11th happened that I felt the calling to serve. I was a student at Des Moines Area Community College, and at the time I was working as an intern for Fox Engineering as an engineering tech and surveyor, and we were out in the field, and 9/11 happened, and our boss called us and said, "You guys got to get into the office, something's horrible's happened." So we went back into the office, and we were listening to the news, and then there was about 30 engineers and interns all huddled in the conference room, and we were watching these horrific pictures, and then hearing President Bush's words a few days later, it just really struck a chord with me. But that night I decided, his words came a few days later, but that night I decided to go and talk to a recruiter and enlist. And so my dad decided to talk me into finishing school. So I held off, finished school, and then enlisted in. And that previous winter at Christmas time, if you remember, Band of Brothers came out, and I was fascinated with Band of Brothers, and I thought the 101st was really kind of cool. And so I had talked to my recruiter, and after talking with my brother about it, I decided and asked that I wanted to go to the infantry, and I wanted to pick my duty station, which would land me at the home of the 101st Airborne Division. Our primary focus was presence patrols, and we were tasked with guarding the NOC, and that was the northern Iraq oil field and its refinery. That was our mission. That was our critical mission, and so a lot of our resources and time went into securing that and the pipeline and all of that stuff. We didn't have, while we were there, we didn't have any major incidences, and we deterred all attacks for the 12 months that we were there. The end of the deployment, right towards the end of that deployment, was right when the insurgency was starting to begin and stand up. And so we started, in fact, our battalion was one of the first to have an improvised explosive device used against it in northern Iraq. And along that same time, we had been upgraded the first gen in up armor. That first generation of up armor, we fielded that. So we felt a little sense of protection with that. And at that time, it was doing a pretty good job. Came back, and we immediately got a new battalion commander and sergeant major. And our battalion commander was a stud he had come from special operations from 1st Ranger Battalion, Colonel McGee, and he set off to, in his opinion, I don't think we were trained well enough. And we set off on the next 8 months of just grueling training. And he basically brought in what he saw the Ranger battalions doing, and he did a similar TFT is what we call them. And so the next many months were just full of a lot of training and all of that stuff. I knew that I wanted to continue to progress as an individual soldier as well. So around the same time, I started to make my plans to go to Ranger School, and successfully made it through Ranger School and got the coveted Ranger tab. That was a very neat experience in my military career. I wanted to be the tip of the spear. I wanted to be the best. And so I figured, and there were people that I looked up to. Colonel McGee was definitely somebody I looked up to. Sergeant Mack was somebody I looked up to. And these guys all had these qualifications in these schools. And so it was just kind of a natural progression. If you wanted to be the best, that's what you did. And so that's why I did it. Colonel McGee was definitely a tactician, a great leader, and wanted his battalion that he felt would be the main effort in the next phase of the war, prepared for whatever we would face. And he had a lot of insight into that, in the sense of he knew what was happening in Iraq and that it was changing into this insurgency, and because of his background in special operations, he and kind of understood and could foresee what was going to happen. And so our training took on a much more feverish pitch. We did a lot of room clearing. We did a lot of battle drill 6 is what we called it, entering and clearing a room. We practiced a lot of mount training and trained in stuff to get us ready for an urban fight. Colonel McGee and our leadership wanted to train us what they were calling small kill teams, SKTs. And so they comprised a sniper team with a recce team and married those two, and we were all cross-trained to give us a larger team to conduct these SKTs. And so for the last 3 months of our train up, we were primarily training for the small kill team operations to target these IEDs and placers and the insurgents there. On one of the SKTs, we had decided to take 2 teams because it was highly contested area. There was a ton of IED activity, and we set in overwatching this large field that probably used to be like a soccer field, but it was just torn up and trash and all of that stuff. But there had been a lot of IED activity from that, and S2 had guesstimated that that's where the trigger points were. And so we had got in clean, as we called it, and set up. And the next morning, about 06, right when the call for prayer came, not even 150 meters in front of us, there were 2 guys that came out of one of these IED firing holes. We didn't see them the night before because they were completely asleep there. They came up out of this hole in the ground, and they rolled their prayer mats out and they started to pray. And then we waited for them to watch what they were doing, and then we observed them in placing wire and IEDs, and they kept moving back and forth between this small hut or shack, and they were pulling rounds out. And so anyway, we had clearance to go ahead and engage once we saw the rounds and what they were doing. And so we had engaged those guys, quailed the threat with them, and all of a sudden the city just popped off. I mean, there was gunfire everywhere. And the mosque, they were calling for jihad over the mosque that was like 250 meters in front of us. And so, I mean, at that point, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I mean, it was absolutely on. And so we were taking fire from basically 360 degrees. We went to the roof with our 240s, with our AT4s, and we were engaging insurgents all around us. We immediately had called for our extraction. Our QRF was a few miles away. Well, our first QRF that was coming to get us hit an IED, and they had multiple vehicles down. And so they were, while responding to that, our secondary QRF, a little bit further out, started to respond. They came in, took them maybe 15, 20 minutes to get there. This whole entire time, I mean, we were just guns a-blazing, fighting pretty tooth and nail at that point. I mean, it was just a target-rich environment. People were coming out of their houses with crew-served weapons and just joining the fight. And I'll never forget, looking down this long stretch that I was watching, there was this guy that came out of his house, literally just looked like an American with his briefcase, but it was a crew-served machine gun, just to come out and join the fight. They were just coming out of the woodwork. And we just kept engaging them. They just kept coming. It was insane. And so when our secondary QRF got to us, they had decided to pull up in front out in this field. Well, they had taken such intense fire that the lead truck was knocked out. And so, I mean, guns are just blazing. I mean, the insurgents are coming out of the woodwork. And so our platoon leader was in that convoy. He decided to have us exfil from the building, and we were going to basically circle the wagons. And so he literally got the trucks in a 360 degree with all the machine guns, and we sat there for the next two and a half hours and just duked it out. Yeah, AT4s, 50 cal, just going Winchester on all of that stuff. It was just absolutely insane. ISR reported that there were probably 200 or 300 insurgents that were circling us, and they would come up one block and they would engage, and then they would disappear, and there'd be a lull, and then they would come from another angle, and then a lull. And so the other convoy that was first dispatch had got to us at this point, and so we were able to get the vehicle that was down. I don't even really, I was so involved in the fight, I don't even know what they did to the vehicle, how they got it towable, but we were able to start exfilling from there. But it was 2 hours of just nothing but an absolute intense firefighter. Vehicles coming at us. I disabled multiple vehicles myself with my 203. I mean, it was like the wild, wild west. But the cool thing about that whole story was I remember just feeling invincible that day. And not really because of me, but that day, thousands of miles away, my mom, who's always been a very devout, religious woman, my parents at their home always flew the flags of our unit when we were deployed, since they have 4 of us that served. That was what their tradition that they started. They would fly the 101st flag or fly my brother's flag from, and so anyway, my mom had come home, and on their back balcony, the flag of the 101st was flying, and it was messed up in the banister of their second floor balcony deck up there. And she didn't like it. And that wasn't like my mom to be worried about stuff like that. She would not usually, but it bugged her. So she went up to the second floor balcony, went out. She said she touched the flag, and she was just, fear just struck her. And she was like, something's going on with Jessie. I need to get on my hands and knees and pray. And she prayed for like 2.5 hours until she felt this presence. And I'm getting goosebumps telling the story, that it was okay for us, but there was not one of us that took a wound that day. And I mean, not a nick, not a scratch, nothing. And I believe that there's some divine power that looked over us that day, because the numbers were so overwhelming against us, and just everything went perfect that day, and nothing, I mean, there was not a scratch on any of us. It was absolutely a really unique story. And we didn't figure it out until a few months later, but we put the whole story together, and it was really kind of neat. Definitely God's divine hand in my life. We were pushing out, like I said, south, I believe it was, of Samara, and we were doing a recce, or reconnaissance, for a future SKT, and it was my turn to take lead. And because of the IEDs, we had a rotation. And I just remember getting this sixth sense that something wasn't right. And I literally had just told all the guys, be on, sharp eyes, and everybody was looking, but there was absolutely no indications of everything. Everything was blown smooth. You couldn't see any tracks or anything like that. And the next thing I know, just this massive bright light and just being ejected. And that was the last thing that I remember. And then flown to Balad, and where I was unconscious and in the hospital out of it for a couple weeks. A lot of the doctors were not on my side as far as wanting that comeback, but it was definitely something that I had set my mind to. And so after a lengthy recovery and getting the blessings of the neurologist and Dr. Twilley and all of the staff at the traumatic brain or the TBI center in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, I was returned to full duty. I had previously, about 2-3 months prior to that, started training to get back into physical shape and to make a run at selection for the Ranger Regiment. In total, took part in over 600 special operations and conventional missions across the course of my career. For me, the injuries, I didn't choose them, and I would have definitely wanted to continue on in my service and go to the 20-year mark if I could have. I mean, that was my plan. I was indefinite. I definitely feel like I did what I set out to do, and take a lot of pride in the KC missions and the fact that we went after the type of people that would do harm to our kids. These guys were definitely evil. And I stared evil in the face and conquered it.